Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. We're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. Captain Gary Barnhill has distinguished himself flying some of the most challenging, but also some of the most capable combat-proven aircraft in the U.S. arsenal, including the F-105 Thunder Chief, which he flew in some of the most hostile skies on Earth and in heavily defended airspace of North Vietnam. He is going to share these and many other exploits with us today. Captain, the podium is yours.
Cindy, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out today. Everyone knows a good story starts with once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was this young boy, 4 years old, and he soloed this steerman. As a future fighter pilot, I learned that what I lacked in skill and talent could be covered up with gross exaggeration. 1955, I left the rural charms of Kansas and joined the Air Force pilot training program called Aviation Cadets. Our first training plane was the Beechcraft T-34, and then the North American T-28, and then the Lockheed T-33 jet. And then at this point, we got our second lieutenant bars and pilot wings. We were Air Force pilots. But there was more training. In my case, it was gunnery school and the Republic F-84F at Luke at Phoenix. And here we learned to use the airplane as a weapon. Drop bombs, shoot guns, dogfighting. Then advanced school, advanced gunnery school in the North American F-100A at Nellis Air Force Base, Las Vegas. 2 years after being locked up as cadets, we were cut loose in Sin City, Las Vegas. Here we learned two things. Number one, how to deliver a nuclear bomb. And number two, we learned that Las Vegas showgirls were not interested in a second lieutenant making $295 a month. All right, we're now officially fighter pilots, which a lot of you know, like Bob Ettinger here, is the ultimate scam. You get paid to play with a $50 million toy, free gas, and free world travel. My first squadron assignment was Ramstein, Germany. The test pilot who evaluated the F-100 advised the Air Force, do not buy this dangerous airplane. It's going to kill a lot of young pilots. Well, the Air Force was sensitive to that criticism, so they bought only 2,294. The accident rate for the first 100,000 hours was an incredible 44. I think today the F-15 modern fighter, Mach 2 fighter, the accident rate is 2 compared to our 44.
Design problems weren't limited to the potentially fatal control losses experienced at high speed. At low speeds, the plane could also be very unforgiving. Here, a pilot realized that he undershot his landing point and frantically attempted to pull his plane up. In opening his throttle too fast, he induced a compressor stall, and then, in a series of overcorrections, fatally compounded his problem. This incident was not unique, and the term saber dance gained a new and darker meaning.
Just 2 months into our first squadrons, out of all that gunnery training, 6 of my 13 classmates were already dead in this airplane. Why, you ask? Too much airplane, too little experience. Before tail hooks were installed, which later on were, we had this giant barrier to prevent overruns. That barrier was useful in Europe with the short, wet runways, 220 mile per hour on final, about a 12-degree deck angle, because the F-100C didn't have any flaps. It also had an old-fashioned anti-skid that was left over from the bicycle shop in Dayton. We flew this dangerously lopsided fuel tank configuration. I don't know if you can see in that picture, there's 2 tanks on the right, only 1 on the left. We didn't have that big a tail, a vertical stabilizer, didn't have that big a rudder. It was a real issue. The reason we had this lopsided thing was so a nuke could be loaded immediately in case of a war started. And it was a dangerous characteristics for us inexperienced pilots. We had barely 300 hours. My role model and flight commander was Captain Carl Feastamal, and Carl was killed when his aircraft rolled uncontrollably to the right, pulling off a strafing run. He ejected inverted at about 100 feet, not enough room for the chute to open back in those days. Our mission was to deliver a nuclear bomb, in this case a Mark 7, 5 times more explosive power than the Hiroshima bomb. It was called Sitting Victor Alert. We slept in our clothes with our boots on, ready to launch immediately in case World War III started. We had to get out of bed, drive out to our aircraft, start it up, taxi out, and be in the air in 15 minutes. That was a guaranteed number that we had to do. Otherwise, we flunked the rating. After 3 years of setting alert, was selected for the Skyblazer Airshow team. I was trained to fly the left wing and the diamond that you see here, but the Skyblazers were disbanded before the '62 show season began. As consolation prize, they let us choose any Air Force assignment that we wanted, and I chose instructor pilot in the Mach 2 F-105 Thunder Chief at Nellis Air Force Base. During the early stages, we got lots of teasing because our aircraft was grounded frequently because it was crashing and blowing up right and left. This is when we acquired the notorious moniker, the Thud, from the splash of the Thud crashing. There were some teasing examples. A couple are, Republic was going to make the 105 out of cement, but then they learned steel was heavier. Had you heard that one, George? Someone said paint the Thuds yellow and use them for ground power units, $50 million ground power unit. It was, in fact, a triple threat fighter. It could strafe you, it could bomb you, or it could just fall out of the sky on top of you. We had a 20 millimeter Gatling gun, and that sucker would shoot 100 of these in 1 second. 1,001, 100 of these. You will note the barrels are lined up with that left air intake, and that comes into play a little bit later. I'm going to play a short video, very short, and this is a ground-based Gatling gun that shoots 4,500 rounds a minute. Our 105 shot 6,000 rounds, fully 1/3 faster than what you're about to see. During a firepower demonstration on the North Korean border, early '65, I thought it would look really cool to fire the entire 1,000 rounds. Is what we carried. That would be 10 seconds. But that 10-second burst starved the air coming into the intake. And unbeknownst to me, flames were shooting out of both ends of the aircraft. Ground control was screaming, "You're on fire, bail out, bail out, bail." I got off the trigger, everything was okay. Watch the front of the aircraft at the beginning of this short video for a 1-second burst as the 105 with the Gatling shoots down a drone, and imagine me doing this for 10 seconds on the border of North Korea. Thuds shot down 24 MiGs with this gun during the Korean War. Our final approach speed was 220 miles per hour, even with full flaps. This being a Mach 2 aircraft, it had a 45-degree swept wing and required some speed even for landing. The student would go Mach 2 on his 4th training flight when he went through the program, and never again, probably, because it required clean wings, and there was always fuel tanks, you're going somewhere, bombs, you're bombing somebody. At 35, we go to 35,000 feet, pretty much over the field, plug in the afterburner, And you'd sit there and watch the Mach meter go 1.7, 1.8, 1.9, 2. Going Mach 2 was a non-event, no theatrics. But at Mach 2.1, things got really interesting because you're out of gas. Ironically, being out of gas, you couldn't come out of afterburner. So you had to slow it to 1.3 by throwing these huge speed brakes out, making a hard turn, then you could come out. If you accidentally, which a few people did, of course I never did this, but other guys inadvertently came out of afterburner before Mach 1.3, the most god-awful, blood-curdling vibration you could imagine, you'd be right back in afterburner until you got it down to 1.3. By the way, I know there's a lot of people here from the industry, and the B-1 bomber, you probably know this, was supposed to be a Mach 2 aircraft. And the reason it wasn't is the variable air inlets that we had that moved in those two intakes were deemed too heavy and too expensive. So they didn't use them, and that limited the B-1 bomber to Mach 1.25. Okay, now we get to the air war, the good stuff. This is me at age 29, Tak Lee Royal Air Base, Thailand. All of the 105s, 4 squadrons, were based in Thailand. Rolling Thunder was the beginning of the bombing of North Vietnam in March of '65. The object was persuade the North to stop supporting the communist insurgency in the South. Thuds and other aircraft flew over 100,000 missions over North Vietnam, but the US was still fighting 8 years later, not the 6 weeks as advertised. Why? Significant targets like airfields and harbors that might have ended the war in weeks or months couldn't be touched. They were off limits. Basically, the rules of engagement just plain sucked. It was like fighting with one hand tied behind your back. Is that a big deal? Well, yeah. Every day when you go to work, somebody's trying to kill you. So a lot of restrictive rules was not good. I'm now going to play a couple of 1-minute movie trailers. And these are for the trailers from the documentary Thud Pilots, which Cindy mentioned. It's the #1 documentary on Amazon at the moment. I think it's approaching 1 million views, and if you have Amazon Prime, you can watch it for free.
Thud losses continued to mount to levels where pilots began to wonder if they were strapping into their cockpit or their coffin.
There were so many things at the ROE and that show that made absolutely no sense.
Keep going as long as it'll fly.
We landed with 2 minutes of fuel left in the chopper on the USS Halsey.
We first had the missions going up north Vietnam. We were not allowed to bomb half the targets.
We had to overfly the MiG bases. We couldn't touch them. We should have bombed their airfield. So those two things cost us dearly.
Only 2 of us made it to the target, and it was the new wing commander. The other 2 had been shot down.
Lieutenants were in short supply, I found out. Most of the reason was everybody was busy getting shot down.
The guys that I flew with, the guys that I was in prison with, a bunch of band of brothers. He who shares his blood with me shall forever be my brother. They're the best friends I've ever had. But a band of brothers.
And the second trailer?
The F-105 was the deterrence to that threat.
The missions we sat were one-way nuclear missions.
Thud pilots would soon realize their primary mission was about to change.
When we crossed into North Vietnam from Laos, in the last 50 miles in, it was nothing but anti-aircraft fire. And suddenly I took a direct hit.
F-105 was really well suited for the mission that we had in the Hanoi area. It could take a really beating and still bring you back.
You're going to put me in the backseat with some crazy-ass fighter pilot, and you want me to patrol and be a target for SAMs? You got to be shitting me.
Leo Thorismus in number 3 was just almost to beam me off to the right side. I caught his plane exploding, and it was almost totally engulfed in fire.
Gave that pilot a salute. You tell him you'll see him when he gets back, and he didn't return.
So there was this one crazy guy blew up on a tanker 1 second before it exploded. This was Bill Worstrom, the pilot that rescued me.
We typically carried 6,000 pounds of bombs going up to North Vietnam with just one pilot risking his life to deliver that 6,000 pounds. By comparison, about 20 years earlier, the B-17 on a long run would carry 4,000, but required 10 crew members risking their lives to deliver that load. In 1965, we were still dropping the same dumb bombs as World War II. All that fancy guided bomb stuff came later, about 72. We needed a 2,000-pound water injection auxiliary thrust system to get the 53,000-pound Thud airborne. Sometimes on takeoff roll, that water injection would blow out like a candle in a wind, and you couldn't get airborne, and you couldn't get stopped, and you ended up dead in a ball of fire. It averaged about once a month while I was at TOC Lee. There were 753 D and F models, which were the ones that fought in Vietnam. 397 were lost over there, 53% of the fleet. Our targets were 1,300 to 1,400 miles an hour round trip, almost 3 hours round trip. Sometimes it was longer if you went out and refueled, went back because of rescuing somebody that was down. We refueled off a KC-135 tanker, it's a Boeing 707, every mission before going downtown due to the distance. On the right map, the blue lines are refueling tracks, and the red lines is the flight up to the Hanoi area and back. We had great respect for the tanker pilots. Sometimes they risked their lives going beyond the Laos border to refuel us, saved us from bailing out over enemy territory. My buddy, Vic Viscara, painted the villainous from the 1964 James Bond movie, Goldfinger, on the nose of his aircraft. This is a warning. If a nude painting is offensive, please avert your eyes at this time. Pussy Galore became a legend with the tanker crews. The boomer operator would tell the crew, "She's here, she's here!" And suddenly, instead of the boomer's one set of eyes looking out that window, there's 5 sets of eyes. Every tanker crew wanted to say, "I actually refueled Pussy Galore." Air refueling from the boomer's window looks like this. Here's a refueling story back at Nellis now when I was an instructor in the 105. I had a new student on his first ride, young kid right out of the academy. He flinched at this point, bumping the control stick right at the moment of hookup, and that resulted in an extreme porpoise. This plane was 67 feet long and at what is basically a low airspeed, about 320 knots. If you hit that stick too hard, you got in a violent porpoise. When the nose went down, he pulled the entire 48 feet long pipe out of the tanker. And then the nose pitched up and threw the pipe into the air, which landed 12 inches behind my head. Would have crushed my skull. One day, I had a little problem refueling. My call sign was Dodge 2. We were always named after cars. I was connected to a tanker taking on fuel, as you see here. This is the view that John Betts, number 3, had waiting his turn to get on the tanker. John suddenly radioed in a abrupt and a commanding voice, "Dodge 2, you're gushing fuel, back off. Dodge 2, you're on fire, eject, eject, eject." So I immediately backed off and ejected, going about 400 miles an hour at 14,000 feet. The total time from the start of the ruptured fuel tank, while connected to the tanker, to blowing up was only 6 seconds. Betts said, "I ejected 1 second before the plane blew into a massive fireball, about 20,000 pounds of jet fuel, which would be about 3,000 gallons. I've been told being shot out of a cannon at 400 miles an hour qualifies as a significant emotional experience. I got no argument with that. We're born with only 2 natural fears. This is the educational portion of the talk. We're born with only 2 natural fears. All the rest are learned. Fear number 1 is loud noises, like a 400-mile-an-hour wind blast in your face. And fear number 2 is the fear of falling. This ejection combined both fears in one single event. You can't practice this stuff, it just comes. Once you pull either armrest that blows the canopy, and that exposes a lever, a trigger, you tap it, squeeze it, it shoots you out like that previous slide. The lap belt blows open automatically, seat band separator pushes you out, and then the parachute opens automatically. It just goes boom, 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 boom. All happens in, I think, 1.5 to 2 seconds, all automatically. The transition from 400 miles an hour to an instant stop leaves you with black and blue bruises around your crotch like you wouldn't believe. Several pilots had been injured or killed landing in these dense trees. Much what we flew over in Vietnam and Thailand were forests. Now, this is not a pilot in a dense tree, a dense area, and this is not me, this is a file photo, but it's the only thing I came up with, a pilot in a tree. So, the previous week I was flying over this exact same area, and on Guard Channel, which everybody can hear, a para-rescue man was hanging from a hovering helicopter, face to face with a pilot. He was describing the pilot impaled on a tree limb in the area of his testicles. He asked the doctor on the radio, where should I cut around the pilot's testicles to get him off the tree limb? Now, let me backtrack just a minute here. Just the previous month, 3 weeks before, I'd been in a lecture class at survival school. And old sergeant with jump wings said, this parachute cannot be steered. I don't care what you do. It's going to come down like an elevator shaft. If there's something below you, too bad, you're going to land on top of it. But he said, if you're desperate, really, really desperate, you could cut some risers right here. And one of those panels would flop, and then it's somewhat steerable. Cut our own risers. Oh, come on, Sarge, you got to be shitting me. Okay, I looked down at that menacing forest, and you know what was on my mind. My testicles. I pulled out this hook-shaped knife from my pocket. I cut 2 risers here, and I cut 2 risers here, and I was able to steer to a small opening instead of landing on top of the trees. Meanwhile, because it takes 10 minutes to get down from 14,000, when you're up there, it seems like about 2 summers going by, but it's just 10 minutes. While I was descending, Dodge leader organized a rescue helicopter. But he had to depart due to low fuel. He said a rescue chopper's inbound. He's homing on your emergency beacon. This little handheld radio was the crucial communications link. No radio contact, no rescue. So I'd been on the ground for about an hour when I heard a chopper. I was pumped full of adrenaline. Just for fun, I fired all that stuff in my vest, which this is simulates, colored smoke bombs and flares. I was so excited knowing a helicopter had found me. I climbed into the chopper and away we go. It turns out the chopper was not reading my emergency radio. The chopper pilot was wandering around over the trees, searching for the downed pilot, and he saw that fireworks display, and that's how he located me. This is the front half of the airplane that exploded. It blew in half and it pancaked, so you can kind of make out the shape of an aircraft. The cause of blowing up was an automatic fuel shutoff valve had failed. There were 183,000 refuelings going to North Vietnam. This just happened one time. Just luck, I guess. This looks like an atomic bomb, but it's actually a fuel tank shaped like an atomic bomb, so it will fit up in the bomb bay to provide extra fuel. Refueling's pumped in at a high pressure, 200, 400 gallons a minute. That's compared to about maybe 8 gallons a minute down at Costco. So when the fuel valve failed to shut off, the tank was the weakest link. It ruptured, fuel was enveloped the aircraft, was sucked into the hot section, and it really was literally like pouring fuel onto a fire. On the left is Charlie Baswell. He was the crew chief of this aircraft that blew up. He tracked me down, because I didn't know him at the time, we always flew a different airplane. He tracked me down 42 years after the Thud blew up. For 42 years, Charlie was racked with guilt that he may have done something wrong that caused the plane to explode and me almost killed. Charlie, buddy, you did absolutely nothing wrong. It was a freak shut-off valve failure. End of story. After the rescue helicopter, which was back at Phnom Penh, we couldn't pronounce Phnom Penh, so we called it Naked Fanny. That's in Thailand. I went to the O Club, still mourning. I met a cadet classmate. He flies me back to my base, Tak Lee, in an unmarked CIA T-28. My pay was less than $1,000 a month. He tells me he's making $5,000 a month shooting guns and rockets for the CIA. That's about $35,000 in today's money. He arranged a CIA job for me with Air America. Stress was handled the old-fashioned way, booze and gallows humor. On the latter far left is John Betts, who commanded the bailout, which is a whole other story, him taking responsibility to do that. In the photo, attending the official tactics conference that night at the Officers Club, on the left is Lieutenant Bates, then John Betts again in the bar with a little mustache and a white polo. Gail Williams was the leader. He was a former Thunderbird left wing. Jamie McLaughlin, Major Foxy Flowers, and me, with some smart-ass sign they hung around my neck. I don't remember what it said, but something like, "Don't touch, he's gonna blow up." Foxy was asked by a young female reporter, "Major, how long will it take the enemy to rebuild that bridge you bombed today?" Foxy was a quiet, reserved little guy. "Lady, we don't build them, we just knock them down." Foxy later on had to eject, but his canopy wouldn't blow off. He ejected through the canopy, but he was decapitated. They wanted to send me off to Clark Air Base in the Philippines for medical evaluation because my neck and my back were pretty messed up. But I feared, as most pilots do, being grounded, and I refused to go. I insisted on flying the next day, although I could not turn my head. I had to move it with my hands. Was that a stupid decision? Why, of course it was a stupid decision. Some days in this business, it helps to be a little stupid. All right, let me back up here. Speaking of being grounded, you want to hear what it takes to get grounded for combat fatigue? Well, you're going to hear it anyway. This is a classic Catch-22 story. Nasty Ned Miller, who was a lovable character in the squadron, was joining up on the tanker, and he was carrying a kind of a semi-experimental 3,000-pound bomb. It malfunctioned, and it had a proximity fuse. It malfunctioned. When it sensed the tanker, it thought it was the ground, and it exploded. His wingman said it just disintegrated in a huge ball of fire. I heard about Ned's death while I was in the air. I felt an impulse to do something special to honor my good buddy Ned. So I screamed down the runway at about 50 feet, pitched up, did an aileron roll like I was an air show pilot or something, a salute to Nasty Ned Miller. My God, the crew chief and the pilots loved it. The CO, not so much. "Barnhill, you're grounded for combat fatigue." Now let me explain the implications of this severe punishment. It meant while my buddies were going to Hanoi every day, getting shot down, killed, and captured, I was not allowed to go along for an entire week. That was my punishment. Let's talk Russian missiles. The Russian-made surface-to-air missile arrived in North Vietnam in early '65, but it wasn't fired at us until 4 months later. LBJ and McNamara gave the enemy 4 months grace period to set up the SAM sites. It's 37 feet long, a 420-pound warhead, and a 150-foot proximity fuse. That warhead would explode if the missile got within a half a football field, 150 feet. Seldom did the missile actually hit the aircraft. When it exploded, it dispersed a cloud of 3,600 shrapnel fragments, about twice the size of an American BB. Just a few of those fragments in the cockpit or in the engine could bring down the plane. The SAM would crawl up your butt at 3.5 times the speed of sound, or about 2,300 miles an hour. From missile launch to hitting you was maybe 3 to 6 seconds. Here's an example of Russian quality control, because it was the Russians operating this. Note the two SAMs highlighted by the white circles going right past and not exploding, but they didn't always miss. This is a 105 being shot down over North Vietnam by a SAM. AAA, as most everybody knows here, is anti-aircraft artillery. There were 10,000 AAA in North Vietnam, mostly 37 millimeter, a lot of other stuff. Hanoi was the second heaviest defended city in the whole world after #1 Moscow. We were between a rock and a hard spot. Up high, the SAM would kill you. Down low, the intense AAA would kill you. Pick your poison. The lyrics of a very popular song in 1965 were perfect metaphors for these guns shooting at us. Here's that song.
When you're alone and life is making you lonely, you can always go downtown. When you've got worries, all the noise and the hurry seems to help, I know. Downtown, just listen to the music of the traffic in the city. Linger on the sidewalk where the neon signs are pretty. How can you lose? The lights so much brighter there. You can't forget all your troubles, forget all your cares. So go downtown. Things will be great when you're downtown. No finer place for sure. Downtown, everything's waiting for you.
On the left in the wheelbarrow is prisoner of war. It's my best friend, Will Gideon. Will's passed away, but he's got another dear friend, Jim Wilson, here today visiting from the East Coast. Will was shot down by these guns and captured in 1966 and severely tortured. 8 Thud pilots were shot down that same afternoon by these guns. 6 of the 8 pilots were killed or became POWs. Only 2 were rescued. F-105 pilots averaged getting shot down every 33 missions. The rescue rate was only 50%. 158 Thud pilots were killed in action over North Vietnam. 105 Thud pilots became prisoners of war. This now is a brief history of every SAM missile that ever shot down an American aircraft up to July of 1965. Shoot down #1, I think you might remember, was Gary Powers, was on his 28th U-2 spy mission for the CIA over Russia in 1960. At 67,000 feet, a volley of 14 SAMs would fire at Powers U-2. No hits, but the U-2 disintegrated from the shock waves caused by the exploding SAMs. Ike and Khrushchev, you'll remember, were meeting in Paris, and of course that blew up. On 21 October of '62, which was a Sunday, I got a call at the BOQ. Strangely, secretively, I was ordered to take 8 Thuds to McCoy Air Force Base, a SAC base in Florida. Why? You'll find out when you get there. On 22 October, the next day, JFK told the nation Russian nukes are in Cuba. 2 days later, the American blockade stopped the first Russian ships. Next day, American military went on the highest alert in U.S. history, DEFCON 2. The next day, Castro urges a nuclear first strike. The next day, I watched Major Rudy Anderson take off on his 10th U-2 spy mission. 2 SAMs were fired. 1 exploded behind him, sent shrapnel into his cockpit, punctured his pressure suit up that high, and presumably died instantly. And that was the second ever SAM shoot down in history. The next day, 28 October, the Cuban Missile Crisis was over. World War III was avoided. The third shoot down was an Air Force F-4C Phantom downed over North Vietnam July 24, 65. That was the end of that 4-month period I said was a grace period. Remarkably, pilot Dick Kern was a B-17 co-pilot in World War II. He was shot down and a POW for 9 months. This time, he would be a POW for almost 8 years. We'd been pleading for 4 months for permission to hit the SAMs before they proliferated all over the place. Request denied, request denied, request denied. But now that they were killing us, LBC said, okay, take them out. Now I'm going to give you the first 3 retaliation missions against the Russian SAM. The first retaliation mission by the Air Force, these are all Air Force missions, was 3 days after that Phantom was shot down. It's extensively written about in books today, especially when 105 pilots get together and talk. Guys that were on that mission, everybody knows. Headquarters handed down a stupid attack plan, a major goat rope, a tragic cock-up of dumb and dangerous tactics, resulting in a horrifying debacle. 6 Thuds lost. Thud pilots are a small group, we all knew each other. Walt Costco, Jack Farr, Bart Bartholomew all killed on that mission. Kyle Bird and Bob Purcell were captured and became POWs for 8 long years. Only one of the 6 pilots down, Frank Tulo, was recovered in a daring rescue. The SAMs had been replaced with bamboo dummies, painted white. But a whole horde of AAA had been brought in anticipating the retaliation. Like, how did they know? It was a total ambush. A clever trap had been set, and we walked into it. The second retaliation attempt was 2 weeks later. 12 Thuds hit a SAM site. Now, when I say hit a SAM site, this is based on, these SAMs were located based on reconnaissance photographs. 12 Thuds attacked the site, but again, the missiles had been moved. And again, additional AAA had been brought in. And those 12 Thuds got really hammered. The next set of slides is a description of the third retaliation mission 2 months later. I was one of 8 Thud pilots on that mission. Lieutenant Commander Trent Powers, XO of VA 164 off the USS Oriskany, came over to our base in Thailand with his A4E Skyhawk. Very similar to this bird right here. He would lead 8 Thuds in a White House-directed, hunter-killer, experimental mission to find and destroy a SAM site. Powers A4 had, I call it a magic black box. You technical guys will know it as an APR-23. It would point to a SAM if the SAM's radar was on, pointing at us. No more relying on outdated reconnaissance photographs like those first 2 retaliation missions. We took off, the Navy guy and 8 of us. We refueled and we headed downtown, only to find a solid overcast over the letdown point. The mission was a no-go. And abort for bad weather. Turn around, go back home. But Powers didn't abort. Instead, he gave a slight wing rock, which is the pilot's silent command to join tight on my wings, which we did, and a 9-ship Vic descended into the clouds, following a man we'd only known for a few hours. Nearing the target, we broke out of the clouds. We went to the deck, no longer in formation, jinking right and left, trying to avoid the intense gunfire. Low is good, fast is good. This technique was before SAM electronic things were carried on the airplane, so this was the technique in early '65. We were sacrificial goats, offering ourselves up as bait to tempt the SAM operators to turn their radars on. Trent had briefed that he was going to go across level and do a skip bomb because he had high drag snake eye bombs. He transmitted on the radio, "I've got him on the nose. I'm starting my bomb run." I watched as he flew directly towards the target at low level. Trent was blown to bits from withering ground fire. No one could have lived through that explosion. Now it was my turn. I lit the afterburner, zoomed up to about 8,000 feet to make a 30-degree dive bomb. I'd like to report that I was your classic, super cool fighter pilot. Hell no, I was scared to death. In fact, I clearly remember saying out loud to myself in a plaintive voice in my oxygen mask, Oh, shit, I don't want to do this. I rolled in and started my dive bomb run, entering that same withering AAA that had just blown Powers to bits. I tracked the Pipper on the target. Bullseye, bombs on targets. The first Russian SAM ever destroyed by the Air Force. But the AAA gunners had plastered me pretty good. I had a fire warning light. A fire warning light means get ready to eject real soon. I headed for the water, full throttle, 810 knots, about 1,000 miles an hour. That's the canopy melt limit speed, so we couldn't go any faster. If we ejected over the water, the Navy would pick us up. But when I got over the water, my fire warning light went out. Hallelujah. No need to eject. I did it last month. It wasn't that much fun. I was absolutely euphoric. But I was also really low on gas. I saw this small enemy boat coming offshore to capture any American pilot that bailed out over the water. I found a tanker, got hooked up. I was really low on gas. Gauge was approaching zero. And then I headed home. There were 37 hits all over the airplane, everywhere except the highly vulnerable underbelly where the engine is, where just one bullet, one shot could bring the plane down. Part of the tail was shot off, 37 millimeter was embedded in the wing. Lieutenant Commander Trent Powers was awarded the Navy Cross. Most of you know that's just one level below the Medal of Honor. We learned 20 years later, Trent survived that ejection, unbelievable, but he died in a POW camp. I don't know if it was from injuries or what reason. I don't think even the family knows. I don't have the citation for Trent's Navy Cross, but these are excerpts from a DFC awarded to a pilot on that mission. Hunter-killer mission, deep within hostile territory, encountered withering ground fire, pressed the attack, dropped bombs in the heart of the target complex. Remarkable mission, overwhelming odds, skill, aggressiveness. There's a turning point in every story, and here it is. It seemed like every mission, the North Vietnamese were laying in wait with AAA and SAMs. Well, many years later, we learned the truth. And to this day, it's difficult to handle that truth. Shown here are President Johnson, Secretary of Defense McNamara, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk. These men micromanaged the war from the White House, 8,000 miles away. LBJ said proudly, "You can't bomb an outhouse unless I approve it." Former Secretary of State Dean Rusk was asked on television, "It has been rumored that the United States provided the North Vietnamese government with the names of the targets that would be bombed the following day. Is there any truth in that allegation?" The former secretary responded, "Yes. We didn't want to harm the North Vietnamese people, so we passed the targets to the Swiss embassy in Washington with instructions to pass them to the North Vietnamese government." Now we know why our losses were so heavy over North Vietnam. We had given up the most basic rule of warfare, the element of surprise. Returning veterans were unfairly blamed for the decisions of politicians. But today, Vietnam vets are warmly respected. In fact, serving in Vietnam is now so respected, for every 5 guys walking around saying, "I was in Vietnam, I've served in Vietnam, I was in combat in Vietnam," statistically, 4 of the 5 are lying, including a sitting United States Senator. The Thud was retired in 1984. A special flyby included the only 2 105 pilots awarded the Medal of Honor, Merle Dethelson and Leo Thorsness. And that's the end of my Thud story, but I'm going to very briefly show you what I did after the Air Force. The CIA contract chased me across Pacific 4 times, never caught up with me. The guy hired me on the phone, was kind of disappeared. So I went down and got a job with TWA in '66. A month later, that contract caught up with me, then forwarded all these places, and was a contract to be a CIA pilot. But there had now been an interesting development. The pilot and the hostess training were in the same building. We all rode the same elevator together. The proximity to dozens of beautiful young women had a magical effect, technically known as an acute case of reality. Coffee, tea, or me versus going back to Sam hunting and AAAs. My head was finally cleared from the fog of war. One summer, I was part of a 3-ship Pitts open cockpit formation team called the Red Knights with Art Scholl and Joe Hughes. We flew air shows across the US and Canada. Some of you older folks might remember seeing us on Thrill Seekers back about '74. Interesting, I moved out here with that open cockpit airplane in '72. It was brand new. It was serial number 1 of the 2-place Pitts. I called a buddy with TWA. I said, I need a place to put my hangar. I need a place to stay. I want to get a lease or anything. I'm just going to be here 3 months. He fixed me up with Bob Herendeen. How many of you know who Bob Herendeen is? Bob Herendeen was effectively world aerobatic champion. He hangared me with him. And that was great because the guy taught me a couple of things. So I got a start right here at this airport. I founded a pilot leasing business providing 747 pilots to a European airline. And now I'm just an old retired fighter pilot peddling my flying stories. Thank you all for coming out. That's a wrap. Thank you very much. You want to see an old man cry? Before we do questions, 2 things I'd like to say. These are some pretty neat slides, and I didn't make any of them. They were done by a professional slide maker that my son put me onto. And the second thing I want to say is there was nothing exceptional about my combat experience. You talk to any 105 pilot that flew over Vietnam, and he'll have similar stories, probably better stories. So, are there any questions? The gentleman asked about Operation Bolo, which was famous Colonel Robin Olds tricking the North Vietnamese and shooting their butts out of the sky. That was behind my time, and I was not an F-4 pilot, but briefly, the military had been doing the same thing it did in World War II. Go up there in the morning, and then go up there in the afternoon. Go up there in the morning, go up there in the afternoon. And so the enemy knew you're going to come up there in the morning, and they also knew the call signs or the name of cars. They knew the route they were coming. So, oh, here they come, the 105s come again. So Robin Olds devised a plan with the Phantoms to fake the enemy out, and he used the call signs of the 105s. He came in the tracks of the 105s, and the MiGs went up saying, oh, more, great duck shooting today. Here come the 105s. And they met up with his F-4s, and I don't know the number of airplanes shot down, but it was quite a few. It seemed like 7 or 8. And the North Vietnamese were a little bit more reluctant to jump in the air after that. Thank you for that question. The gentleman's question is, the shells are going up, and if they missed, they had to come back down. Did they do any damage? I can only surmise that if you happen to run into some of that metal coming down, it would be just like throwing it in the intake, sitting on the ramp. So it would probably bring the plane down. I never heard of it happening. The question is from Captain Royce Williams. He noticed that some airplanes are 1 place and some are 2 place. I should have cleared this up, a couple of things. In the beginning, we were all single place aircraft. And then we found out that we didn't really have tactics to suppress the SAMs, and they were really kicking our butt. So that was the invention of the Wild Weasels. And originally 6 Wild Weasels came, 2-seaters. 5 of the 6 were shot down before they finally nagged a SAM. And then they were replaced by 2-seat 105s. I just selected pictures that I thought were dramatic, whether it was 1-seat or 2-seat. And you'll also notice that some of them were painted silver, which the birds were, when I was there, the birds were painted silver. There's a well-known book by that name. Later on, they were camouflaged, but I just took good pictures to try to give you a sense of what those missions were like. Jim Wilson, who is a friend of Will Gideon, who's now passed away, that was the POW in the wheelbarrow, is asking about the leaflet drops. And that happened after my time. Will was shot down in '66, and I was there in '65, and I really don't know anything about it. Question is, do we wear a G-suit? Air Force fighter pilots always wear a G-suit, even the Thunderbirds. And it's kind of a thing between the Thunderbirds and the Blue Angels. The Blue Angels don't wear G-suits when they do their air shows. I don't know if it's machismo or what it is, but Air Force guys always wear a G-suit. The question is, have I ever met any MiG pilots? I have not met any MiG pilots. I actually met the son of a MiG pilot who was a very wealthy Chinese guy. Apparently, if you were a MiG pilot in China, you were literally upper crust of society. There was a reunion in San Diego where some of the MiG pilots came over and they literally paired up with guys that had shot down each other or whatever. It was remarkable to read about. I personally haven't met any of them. They were asking questions like, which airplane was better, who was better, Navy, and the guys were real diplomatic. They dodged the questions. The question is, why didn't President Johnson carpet bomb with the B-52s? I try to stay away from politics except just some of the facts that I threw up there. But, you know, I said that the mission of Rolling Thunder was to persuade, not go up there and kick their butt and get it over with like we did in Desert Storm in '91 in 42 days. It was to persuade them gently, apply a little pressure. Well, 8 years that didn't work. So who knows what his thinking was. Some people say he was afraid of bringing in China and Russia because they provided the equipment, but I don't know the answer really to what his thinking was. The question was, have I had the opportunity to go back to the weapons school at Nellis Air Force Base, which is the Air Force's version of Top Gun, where they develop tactics and do experiments and all that. I know of a lot of those guys over the years, and during reunions, we've been invited out to Nellis, and we've been taken on tours. I actually saw my first AAA up close, my first 37 millimeter, my first SAM missile up close. They have them all in the museum there. The question was, how about something about the transition of the Wild Weasel mission from the 105 to the Phantoms. What I know is 6 F-100s showed up while I was there at Talk-Lee. 5 of the 6 were shot down before they bagged a SAM in December. For a long time I read that the Wild Weasels bagged the first SAM ever. And then I wrote an article which was widely published about this mission that I described today. And so the Wild Weasels changed the story to the first Wild Weasel kill was December '65. The 100s couldn't keep up with the 105. So they transitioned to this 2-seater. And by the end of the war, when they had the Thud out in '84, there weren't enough 105s to sustain training, mechanics, bits, and parts. Like 150 airplanes left. So, and they were getting old. And so they went to the F-4. Now I think they're flying F-16s now. Question was about the go to hell hats that we wore, both the enlisted guys. You know, normally there's some military caps, the round hat, the flight hat, sometimes maybe ball hats later on. But we adopted a hat over there. There was always heavy sun and rain during the monsoons. And this was kind of a wide-brimmed hat. And to give it a little sachet, we put one side up like that. It kind of looked like the Australians. And that was kind of, and guys would mark how many missions they had, how many bombs they had dropped. Mostly they'd mark, if you had to do 100 missions before you could go home, there'd be an X for missions, and if they got 100, they could go home. The question is, did we go low, did we go high? In '65, in the beginning, there were no SAMs. So we went in at 17,500, rolled in at a 60-degree dive angle, which feels vertical, I got to tell you. And we'd drop our bombs at about, I think, 7,500, high G pull out, try to get out of the guns before 4,500. Well, then the SAMs came along while I was there. Well, if you go over 17.5, you're a sitting duck. So then we started coming in low and doing that pop-up that I discussed. That change happened while I was there. Then later on, they got electronic jamming pods, I think they're called, that they carried on the wing. Now they were able to get above the AAA, I believe. I didn't follow the war that closely after I left in '66, but tactics changed continually based on what the enemy was doing. Well, I met the cadet classmate. I've been asked, would I say a few more words about the fact that I was going to become a CIA pilot. I met my cadet buddy in the officers club at Phnom Penh. He flies me back in this unmarked plane. He didn't have to ask anybody's permission. I thought that was pretty cool. And he's telling me about his missions. He's dropping bombs and all this stuff, Laos, Cambodia, I think, I don't know. And he said they're very selective about who they hired, but he knew me and he'd recommend me. So he called a guy in Washington, and when I got home, I called the guy in Washington and said, yeah, we'll send a contract. It's for a Vietnamese passport. Doesn't really say much, but you'll figure it out when you get here. So I went home, and the envelope never came. And it never came, it never came, it never came. I had changed squadrons 3 times in 1 year, chasing combat assignments with open slots. So I called up and I said, I'm getting out February 7th, just like you told me, to be in Vientiane. But it wasn't him on the phone, it was the secretary. I said, can I talk to the guy? No. When? Don't know. Where is he? Out of the country. When will he be back? We don't know. Maybe never. So nothing. I couldn't do anything. So then I went off and got the Air Force job. And then that envelope came, and it had a bunch of papers, pretty vague, to sign to be a CIA pilot. It was all about excitement and money combined. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you really for coming out. Thank you very much. You're very kind. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.